My neighbor warned me, people talk. I smiled and said, let them imagine the rest. I moved into the apartment complex at the beginning of spring, a small, quiet building tucked between old maple trees and the hum of city life. The kind of place where mornings smell like wet concrete and coffee from someone else's kitchen. I didn't plan to stay long. It was meant to be a temporary stop, a year, maybe less. But I didn't know that home sometimes hides in the people we never expect to meet. The first time I saw her was on my second evening there. She stood on the balcony next door, tending to a row of potted plants that looked far too alive for someone who seemed so still. She moved slowly, gracefully, as though every leaf deserved her full attention. Her name, I would later learn, was Clara, and she had the kind of presence that didn't ask to be noticed but somehow always was. From my side of the balcony, I could hear faint piano notes drifting through her open door. Nothing showy, just soft, deliberate chords that filled the evening air. She didn't see me watching, and I didn't mean to stare. But there was something comforting about her, like she belonged to another time, one where people still wrote letters by hand and waited for the rain to stop before speaking. Days passed, and our paths crossed in the hallway, near the mailboxes, by the front gate. Always polite, always brief. Good morning. Evening. How's the weather treating you? Her smile never lasted long, but it stayed with me, gentle, practiced, maybe even a little tired. I started noticing the small things about her. How she'd pause before locking her door, as if she were remembering something. How she'd hum softly when the sun hit her balcony in the late afternoon. How her laughter, rare and fleeting, sounded like it surprised even her. I didn't know what she was carrying, but there was a quiet loneliness in her stillness, the kind that comes not from being alone, but from being misunderstood for too long. Maybe that's what drew me to her. Not pity. Not curiosity. Just recognition, that quiet ache of seeing someone who's learned to live behind their calm. At the time, I didn't realize it. But from that very first week, I'd already begun waiting for the sound of her balcony door sliding open at dusk. It started with small things. The kind of moments that barely register to anyone else, a shared elevator ride, a polite nod across the parking lot, the faint echo of her heels against the hallway tiles. But to me, every second felt strangely significant, like a scene I didn't want to end too soon. One evening, I found her standing by the mailboxes, struggling with a stubborn key that refused to turn. I offered to help, awkwardly, almost too eagerly. She smiled, stepping back just enough for me to try. The metal clicked, and the little door swung open with a satisfying clank. She laughed softly, a quiet sound that caught me off guard. "Seems you're better at this than I am," she said. Her voice was low, warm, the kind that lingers for a few breaths longer than it should. That's how it began, our rhythm of short, unimportant exchanges that somehow meant everything. A few days later, I found her standing outside her door with a flickering hallway light overhead. She frowned up at it, muttering something about how it always went out at the worst times. I had a small toolbox from unpacking, so I offered to fix it. She hesitated, then nodded. We stood close as I reached up to tighten the bulb. The air between us hummed with that faint electrical buzz, mixed with something quieter, a shared awareness. When the light steadied, she looked up at me, her face half-lit, half-shadowed. "Thank you," she said, brushing her hair behind her ear. Her fingers trembled just slightly, not from fear, but from something unspoken. "It's nothing," I said. "Just didn't want you to be stuck in the dark." She smiled, a real one this time. "That's kind of you." For a few seconds, neither of us moved. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was heavy, but in a way that felt full, not empty. I could hear the soft hum of the hallway light above us and the faint sound of rain outside. When we finally stepped back, it felt like something had shifted. Not a confession, not a moment of clarity, just a quiet understanding that our lives had brushed against each other's, and neither of us could ignore it anymore. After that night, the air around our conversations carried something new, something fragile, like the first spark before a fire knows it's begun. The rain came without warning, one of those sudden spring downpours that erased the sky in a blur of silver. I was locking up my balcony plants when I saw her again. Clara stood under her porch awning, hugging her cardigan closer, watching the rain swallow the courtyard. I hesitated at my door, unsure whether to go inside or stay. Then she looked over, just a glance, nothing more, but it was enough to feel like an invitation. So I stepped out, crossing the few feet between us, pretending to be surprised by the weather. "Didn't expect this tonight," I said, pushing my wet hair back. She smiled softly. "It never asks for permission, does it?" The rain drummed steadily above us, the smell of wet pavement rising between the cracks. The sound filled the silence that followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. We stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the narrow awning, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her body, mixed with the cool dampness in the air. She glanced at the sky, her voice quiet. "Storms make the world honest. Everything slows down, even people." I didn't know what to say, so I listened. Her words felt heavier than small talk, as if she wasn't just talking about the rain. The wind shifted, carrying a thin mist toward us. Without thinking, I slipped off my jacket and held it out. She hesitated, then let me drape it over her shoulders. The fabric brushed her collarbone, and for a moment, my fingers touched her skin, a light, accidental contact that still somehow made my chest tighten. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling it close. Her eyes met mine, calm, steady, but with something fragile flickering behind them. We talked for a long time after that, about books, music, the smell of old libraries, and how people sometimes confuse solitude with loneliness. Her laugh came more easily as the rain softened to a whisper. When lightning lit up the clouds, I caught the reflection in her eyes, and realized how close we drifted without noticing. The space between us was gone, replaced by that strange electricity that has nothing to do with weather. Neither of us moved. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. But as the thunder rolled softly in the distance, I knew something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a door that had been unlocked without anyone seeing. For a while, everything between us existed in that soft, unspoken rhythm. The morning nods. The shared smiles across the courtyard. The small conversations that carried more silence than words. But silence, I learned, has a way of drawing attention. It started with glances, the kind people think you don't notice. The neighbors who used to greet her began doing it with half smiles now, ones that carried quiet questions. I heard whispers in the stairwell once, my name paired with hers, tangled in sentences spoken too softly to be accidental. I pretended not to care. I thought maybe she didn't either. But then, little by little, Clara changed. She stopped tending her plants in the evening. Her curtains stayed closed even on sunny days. When we crossed paths in the hallway, she smiled like someone who'd been rehearsing it, polite, brief, distant. I tried to tell myself she was just busy, that I was imagining things. But one evening, I saw her on the porch again, staring out into the dusk. I almost didn't go over. Almost. But something in her stillness told me I needed to. She heard my footsteps before she looked up. Her eyes softened for a moment, then turned guarded. "Hey," I said quietly. "Haven't seen you around much." She took a breath, her gaze drifting toward the courtyard lights below. "People talk," she said finally. The words were simple, but they carried a kind of weariness that felt older than both of us. I didn't know how to respond at first. "They always do," I said. "That's what people are best at." She gave a small, sad smile, the kind that hides more than it shows. "You're young. You don't understand how heavy it gets. What they say, what they assume." I wanted to tell her I didn't care. That none of it mattered. But her voice, the way it trembled just slightly, stopped me. She wasn't afraid of them, she was afraid of herself, of wanting something she'd spent years convincing herself she shouldn't. When she turned to go back inside, I caught the faintest scent of her perfume, and it lingered long after her door closed. That night, the building felt quieter than usual, like even the walls knew something between us had been left unfinished. For days after that conversation, her silence felt heavier than any rumor could ever be. The space between our doors grew wider, even though only a few feet separated them. Every evening, I'd hear faint sounds from her apartment, the clinking of dishes, a soft radio tune, the muted rhythm of a woman trying to live normally while something inside her refused to stay quiet. I missed her. Not in the dramatic way people write about, but in the quiet absence that steals your attention when you're making coffee or folding laundry. I missed the sound of her laughter through the walls. The warmth of knowing she was near. One night, I saw the glow of her lamp still burning past midnight. I don't know what pushed me to knock, but I did. 3 soft knocks, hesitant, uncertain. The door opened after a pause. Clara stood there in a loose sweater, her hair slightly tousled, eyes tired but gentle. For a second, she seemed like she might close the door again, then she stepped aside. "Come in," she said quietly. The room smelled of vanilla candles and rain-soaked air drifting through the open window. A record played somewhere in the background, slow jazz, the kind meant to fill silence without interrupting it. We sat across from each other at her small dining table. She didn't ask why I came, she already knew. "I didn't mean to make things harder," I said. "I just didn't want to disappear because people can't mind their own business." She looked down at her hands, fingers tracing the rim of her mug. "It's not you," she said softly. "It's me trying to protect something I don't even have the right to want." I leaned forward slightly, catching her eyes. "You have the right to want peace. To want connection. To want this, whatever it is." Her breath caught. The candlelight flickered between us, warm and fragile. When she finally looked up again, her voice was barely a whisper. "They'll talk again." I smiled, not to dismiss her fear, but to give it somewhere to rest. "Then let them talk," I said. "Let them imagine the rest." For a moment, she just stared at me. Then she exhaled, a slow release of everything she'd been holding in. The tension in her shoulders melted. The air around us softened. And in that fragile quiet, I saw her smile, not the polite one she showed the world, but the real one she'd been hiding from herself. After that night, something changed, not suddenly, but in the quiet, steady way spring turns into summer. There were no declarations, no labels, no promises. Just a shared understanding that whatever existed between us didn't need to be hidden anymore. She began opening her curtains again. I'd catch her standing by the window in the morning light, coffee in hand, her gaze soft and unguarded. When she noticed me looking, she didn't turn away. Sometimes she'd smile. Sometimes she'd wave. Both gestures felt like small rebellions. We started spending time together in ways that looked ordinary to everyone else: grocery runs, late afternoon walks, stopping by the cafe on the corner where no one really cared who sat with whom. But for us, each of those moments felt quietly revolutionary. One morning, I found her waiting outside my door, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured if people are going to talk," she said with a faint smile, "we might as well give them something to talk about." We laughed, softly but freely. That laughter, light, unguarded, became the sound of something healing. When we walked through the neighborhood, her hand would occasionally brush against mine. Sometimes she'd let it stay there. Not always, only when the street was empty or when the courage in her outweighed the fear. But every time she did, I could feel the quiet tremor of it, the risk, the tenderness, the decision to stop hiding. At the farmer's market, I'd see how people still looked. Some smiled politely, others whispered when they thought we couldn't hear. But she held her head high, eyes steady, the same grace that first drew me to her, now carrying something stronger, defiance wrapped in calm. We never spoke about love outright. Maybe we didn't need to. It was there in the simple things, the way she reached out to fix the collar of my jacket, the way I'd linger when saying goodbye, the way silence between us no longer felt uncertain. There was a night when we sat on her porch again, the same one where the rain had once trapped us. The air was warm this time, the city humming quietly in the distance. She leaned against me, her hand resting over mine. No words. No explanations. Just two people learning to exist honestly, even if the world outside their door still hadn't learned how to look at them without wondering. Time has a way of softening the edges of what once felt impossible. Months have passed since that stormy night, and though people still talk, they always do, their words no longer echo as loudly as they once did. Maybe they grew tired of guessing. Maybe they saw that neither of us owed them an explanation. Clara's apartment feels different now. Lighter. The piano still sits by the window, but it's no longer silent. Some evenings, I hear her playing again, the same soft melodies that once drifted through the walls when I first moved in. Only now, I'm often there beside her. She plays, I listen. And sometimes, when the music fades, she'll glance at me and smile like it's our secret language. She started hosting small dinners for a few neighbors, not to prove anything, just to reclaim the air around her name. I helped her cook, chopping vegetables while she moved gracefully around the kitchen, humming to herself. There was something beautiful about watching her in that light, calm, confident, unashamed. That evening, the apartment glowed with laughter and the warmth of shared meals. The very same people who once whispered now complimented her food, her plants, her music. They didn't mention me much, but I caught their glances, curious, soft, a little uncertain. She didn't mind. Neither did I. When everyone left, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of everything we'd survived quietly. She leaned against the counter, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You handled that well," I said, smiling. She laughed. "I've stopped trying to defend myself. It's easier just to live." I nodded, stepping closer. "And what about what they think?" Her eyes met mine, steady, luminous, sure. "Let them think what they want," she whispered. The last of the candlelight flickered across her face. She reached up, her hand resting briefly against my cheek, a simple gesture, but filled with everything we'd never needed to say out loud. We stood there, the world outside quieting into night, and for the first time, it felt like peace. Not the kind that comes from being unseen, but the kind that comes from being known, completely, by someone who chose you anyway. People will always imagine the rest. But what they'll never know is how beautiful it feels when the noise fades, and all that's left is the warmth of someone who stayed. Time has a way of softening the edges of what once felt impossible. Months have passed since that stormy night, and though people still talk, they always do, their words no longer echo as loudly as they once did. Maybe they grew tired of guessing. Maybe they saw that neither of us owed them an explanation. Clara's apartment feels different now. Lighter. The piano still sits by the window, but it's no longer silent. Some evenings, I hear her playing again, the same soft melodies that once drifted through the walls when I first moved in. Only now, I'm often there beside her. She plays, I listen. And sometimes, when the music fades, she'll glance at me and smile like it's our secret language. She started hosting small dinners for a few neighbors, not to prove anything, just to reclaim the air around her name. I helped her cook, chopping vegetables while she moved gracefully around the kitchen, humming to herself. There was something beautiful about watching her in that light, calm, confident, unashamed. That evening, the apartment glowed with laughter and the warmth of shared meals. The very same people who once whispered now complimented her food, her plants, her music. They didn't mention me much, but I caught their glances, curious, soft, a little uncertain. She didn't mind. Neither did I. When everyone left, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of everything we'd survived quietly. She leaned against the counter, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You handled that well, I said, smiling. She laughed. I've stopped trying to defend myself. It's easier just to live. I nodded, stepping closer. And what about what they think? Her eyes met mine, steady, luminous, sure. Let them think what they want, she whispered. The last of the candlelight flickered across her face. She reached up, her hand resting briefly against my cheek, a simple gesture, but filled with everything we'd never needed to say out loud. We stood there, the world outside quieting into night, and for the first time, it felt like peace. Not the kind that comes from being unseen, but the kind that comes from being known, completely, by someone who chose you anyway. People will always imagine the rest. But what they'll never know is how beautiful it feels when the noise fades, and all that's left is the warmth of someone who stayed. If this story touched you, if you've ever felt seen in a love the world didn't understand, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps keep stories like this alive, quiet, honest, and made for hearts that still believe in slow love.